The evening at the community center started like any ordinary Saturday. People wandered in slowly, greeting each other, checking the tables of snacks, and finding seats wherever they felt comfortable. The place was warm with soft lights, and there was a gentle kind of noise, the sort that comes from people talking, chairs moving, kids running around the edges of the hall. No one expected anything unusual to happen. It was just another gathering where people came to relax. She arrived quietly, as she always did. She preferred to keep to herself, blending into the background rather than standing in the center of attention. She volunteered often, usually helping with the setup or keeping things organized. Tonight, she wore simple clothes, nothing that stood out. And she moved around with a calmness that made her easy to overlook unless someone really paid attention. She had a gentle presence that didn't demand space but somehow still filled it. On one side of the room stood an old upright piano. It had been there for years, though hardly anyone touched it. Some of the keys were slightly chipped, and the wood had scratches that told stories of use long ago. It was more decoration than instrument now. People leaned against it or placed cups on the closed lid, never imagining someone might actually play it. A small group had gathered near it, talking and laughing. One of them, a man known for his loud jokes, leaned on the piano with a grin. He liked making people laugh, even if his humor sometimes crossed into teasing. He tapped a key casually, producing a dull, uneven sound. "This thing probably can't even make proper music anymore," he said with a chuckle, looking around for reactions. A few people laughed politely. The piano wasn't exactly inspiring confidence. Then he noticed her walking by, carrying a small tray of cups toward the refreshments table. She wasn't looking at him or the piano, but the man raised his voice just enough for her to hear. "Hey!" he called out, half joking, half challenging. "You ever play anything? Go on, touch a key if you dare. Let's see if this old thing can handle it." People turned to look at her, not in a harsh way, but with mild curiosity. She stopped for a moment, unsure if she should respond. She wasn't used to attention and didn't really want it. She gave a small, polite smile. The kind you offer when you don't want to be rude, but also don't want to join in. The man laughed again. "Come on, just one note." The piano won't bite. It sounded like a joke, harmless enough. But something in the room shifted. Not because of his tone, but because of the way she looked at the piano. Her eyes rested on it a little too long, as if it stirred something in her. The crowd noticed the subtle change in her expression, something distant, something heavy. She set the tray down slowly on a nearby table. People watched without speaking. No one expected her to take the dare seriously, but she took a small step closer to the piano, then a second step. She wasn't smiling now. She wasn't nervous either. She just seemed lost in thought. The man raised his eyebrows, surprised that she didn't walk away. He stepped back slightly as she approached, giving her room. She lifted her hand toward the piano, not touching it yet, but studying it carefully. The wood held marks of age, and the keys were discolored. Yet something about it pulled her in. It was clear to anyone watching that this wasn't just a random moment for her. Someone whispered, "Does she actually know how to play?" Another person replied softly, "I've never seen her near the piano before." She rested her fingers gently on the edge of the instrument. Not on the keys, just the wood. It felt strange under her hand, familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Memories she didn't talk about returned without warning. Long evenings from years ago, music filling rooms that no longer felt the same, hands that once moved freely over the keys. In a moment in her past when everything changed, and she walked away from music altogether. She didn't want those memories right now. Not here. Not in front of these people who barely knew her beyond her quiet presence. She pulled her hand back as if deciding to leave. A few people relaxed, thinking she was backing out. And the moment seemed ready to fade. But then the man spoke again, still joking, unaware of the weight in her eyes. "See? I knew it. Not brave enough." That stopped her. Not because she felt insulted. Not because she wanted to prove anything. But because something inside her snapped into place, something she had ignored for too long, a piece of her that missed music, a part she had tried to keep silent. She turned back to the piano seat. It wasn't comfortable looking, a bit wobbly, but she slowly pulled it out anyway. People watched carefully, sensing that something real might be happening. She sat down, not dramatically, not with a flourish, just gently, quietly, like she was settling into a place she'd been missing without admitting it. The man who had challenged her suddenly grew nervous. His grin faded a little. He didn't expect her to sit. No one did. She placed her hands on her lap for a moment, taking a slow breath. The room grew quieter. Conversations cut off naturally, not because someone asked for silence, but because everyone felt something shifting. Her fingers finally moved again. This time she placed them lightly on the keys, not pressing, not playing, just resting there. Her shoulders softened as she felt the cool smoothness beneath her. Fingertips. She looked down at the keys for several long seconds. Her eyes softened and her breath steadied. She wasn't thinking about the dare anymore. She wasn't thinking about the people watching or the man who had teased her. She was thinking about music. One note. That was all she needed to decide whether she could do this. She pressed a single key. The sound was soft, clearer than anyone expected. Even the man who mocked the piano blinked in surprise. The note seemed to hang in the air, light but steady. She lifted her hand again, letting the tone fade. But instead of standing up, she placed both hands gently over the keys. People leaned in, almost holding their breath. She wasn't sure if she was ready to play again. It had been so long. She didn't know if the music she once had lived inside her anymore. But sitting there, with everyone watching, and the old piano waiting, she felt a quiet strength growing in her chest. It wasn't the room that made her decide. It wasn't the dare. It was the small spark she felt when she touched that first note. A spark she thought she had lost forever. The room stayed still around her, waiting for what she would do next. And she stayed there for a moment, letting the silence wrap around her like a gentle blanket, before she let her fingers move again. For a moment, she kept her hands resting lightly on the keys, as if she needed to feel them before deciding what to do next. The room around her had softened into complete quiet. All the usual small sounds of the community center, people chatting, chairs sliding, kids laughing, seemed to disappear. No one told anyone to be silent, but somehow everyone sensed that something important was unfolding. She took a slow breath. Her fingers trembled, not from fear of the crowd, but from the weight of everything the piano brought back, the memories she had tried so hard to tuck away. Music had once been a big part of her life, a part that shaped her days, a part that calmed her when nothing else could. But life had a way of changing things quickly, and at one point, she walked away from playing completely. Even the thought of touching a piano brought back feelings she didn't know how to handle. Still, here she was. The man who had dared her watched her closely now, but his earlier smirk had disappeared. He didn't look teasing anymore. Instead, he looked like someone trying to understand a moment he didn't mean to create. He hadn't expected her to even pause at the piano, much less sit down. The quietness in her face made him step back, as if afraid to break whatever she was experiencing. She pressed another key. This time a softer note, gentle and almost hesitant, but it carried across the room. The piano might have been old, but the sound had warmth inside it. It's like an old friend speaking after years of silence. People shifted closer without making noise, trying not to disturb her. A few leaned on tables or crossed their arms, watching with an attention that wasn't nosy, more curious, more respectful. They could sense there was a story in this moment, something she didn't usually show. Her fingers moved across the keys, testing a few more notes. She wasn't playing a song yet, just letting her hands remember the feeling, the movement, the familiarity. She closed her eyes briefly. For that short moment, she wasn't in the community center anymore. She was somewhere else, somewhere quieter, where music used to live freely. When she opened her eyes again, she looked a little stronger. Not confident, not quite ready to perform, but more settled. Like she had taken the first step down a path she thought she had sealed off years ago. She lifted her hands and placed them into the starting position of a melody she hadn't played in a long time. It wasn't a complicated piece. It wasn't fancy or dramatic. It was a simple tune she learned as a child, one of the first songs she ever truly loved. Something gentle, something comforting. The moment she pressed the first real chord, a soft hush went through the crowd, even though no one had been talking. It was a natural reaction, like the whole room took a breath together. Her fingers moved slowly at first, almost uncertain. But as she played a few more notes, her hands began to relax. It was as if the music reminded her how to breathe. The melody eased out of the piano, filling the air with something delicate but full of feeling. People watched her face as much as her hands. Her expression softened and her shoulders loosened. She still looked a little sad, but there was also something peaceful there, like she was remembering a part of herself she thought she had lost. The man who had dared her looked down at his shoes, slightly ashamed. He didn't know her story. He didn't know he had pulled her into something deeper than a simple joke. But even he couldn't look away from the music now. She kept playing, letting the melody grow and settle. The piano keys clicked gently under her touch. The sound wasn't perfect. Some slightly out of tune, but her playing made it beautiful anyway. The imperfections gave the song a kind of honesty. As the tune continued, more memories rose in her mind. She remembered practicing for hours after school, her hands moving until the sun faded outside the window. She remembered the person who used to sit beside her, guiding her through difficult pieces, encouraging her, reminding her that music was supposed to be felt, not forced. Those moments were warm, but they were also painful now, because they belonged to a time that no longer existed. Her heart tightened. She paused for a second, lifting her hands as if unsure whether to keep going. The crowd waited, still and patient. Another breath, she continued. The melody shifted slightly, becoming deeper, more emotional. She didn't plan, it simply happened, flowing out of her, as if the piano understood her better than words could. People in the room exchanged small looks, not wanting to speak, but silently agreeing that something was different here. This wasn't just someone playing a random tune. She was telling a story without ever opening her mouth. A couple standing near the doorway stepped inside to listen more closely. A child who had been running earlier now stood by his mother's leg, looking at the piano with wide eyes. Even the volunteers who usually moved around checking on supplies had stopped to watch. She didn't notice any of them. Once she entered the heart of the melody, she disappeared into it completely. Her hands moved with more certainty, and she leaned slightly into the music, letting every note carry a piece of her. She had forgotten what it felt like to express herself like this. Not with words, not with explanations, but through something that came from the deepest part of her. As she continued playing, the sadness in her chest eased into something softer. Not joy, not yet, but a kind of release. The man who had challenged her finally stepped back further, folding his arms and lowering his head. He didn't dare interrupt. The others around him didn't judge him for the dare anymore. They saw the shift in his expression, the regret and the understanding. After a few minutes, she slowed the melody, letting it fade gently instead of ending sharply. Her fingers came to a rest on the keys, and she stayed still for a moment, letting the quiet settle again. But she wasn't done. Something inside her wasn't done. She lifted her hands again, this time placing them at the beginning of a different tune. One she hadn't played since her last real performance many years ago. It was more complicated than the first, filled with rises and drops that required careful movement. She hesitated, unsure whether she had the skill to play it after so long, but she tried. The first few notes wavered, but she steadied her breath, and the music began to shape itself. This piece wasn't gentle. It held more weight, more emotion, more truth. She had learned it during a time in her life when everything felt hopeful and bright, before things changed and she stepped away from playing as she played. Those old feelings stirred again: comfort, excitement, warmth, but layered with the sadness that came after. The melody reflected that mix, creating something powerful. The crowd reacted without speaking. Some leaned forward slightly, drawn deeper into the sound. Others stood completely still, afraid to move and ruin the moment. Her hands glided across the keys, rediscovering the rhythm she thought she had lost. She wasn't perfect. She missed a note here and there, stumbled slightly in the middle, but no one cared. The room didn't want perfection. They wanted realness, and that was exactly what she gave them. The man who had dared her finally whispered to someone beside him, I didn't know she could do this, the person next to him whispered back. I don't think any of us knew. But for once, she wasn't aware of the whispers. She wasn't aware of anything except the music pouring out of her. It felt like releasing something she had kept locked inside for years. When she reached the final part of the piece, her fingers slowed again, carefully guiding the last notes. She let them fade softly, not forcing them to be loud or dramatic. She ended the tune the same way she started, gentle, thoughtful, honest. Her hands lifted from the keys. The room went still. No one clapped yet. They were too caught in the moment to unsure if the music was truly finished. She kept her eyes lowered, breathing deeply, her heart full of too many feelings at once. A full 10 seconds passed before someone finally exhaled loudly, breaking the invisible barrier. Then the room let out a soft wave of reactions, some gasps, some whispers, a few murmurs of amazement. She didn't stand right away. She stayed seated, staring at the keys as though she wasn't sure how to return to the real world after giving so much of herself. The man who had dared her stepped forward but didn't speak. He looked at her with an expression she didn't expect, respect mixed with something like apology. She finally looked up, her eyes soft but a little tired. She didn't smile, but she didn't look upset either. She just looked like someone who had opened a doorway she wasn't sure she was ready to walk through. People waited quietly. Unsure whether to speak or stay silent, she gently closed the piano lid halfway, letting her fingers rest on the wood. For a long moment she didn't move. The music still lingered in the air, as if the room hadn't fully taken its breath back yet. The room stayed completely still around her. Even though the last note had faded into silence, the feeling it left behind hung in the air like something too delicate to touch. She didn't move right away. Her hands rested lightly on the piano as if she were afraid that letting go would break the fragile calm she had created. People watched her with expressions that were a mix of wonder and questions they didn't know how to ask. No one wanted to speak first. No one wanted to interrupt whatever she was feeling. They could see it in her face. Something deep inside her had shifted. Something she hadn't planned on sharing, but it had come out through the music anyway. She slowly sat up straighter, taking a quiet breath. Her heartbeat was still racing, and her mind felt full, almost too full. Like she had opened a door she wasn't ready to look through. She wasn't sure if she should stay seated or stand and walk away. Both options felt heavy. Then the man who had dared her stepped forward. His usual boldness was gone, replaced with hesitation. He looked down for a moment before trying to speak. I didn't know you could play like that, he said softly. His voice wasn't loud or joking anymore. It carried a sincere tone, almost apologetic, but she didn't look up right away. She kept her fingers against the closed lid of the piano, tracing the old scratches without thinking, before she could think of a reply. Someone else near the back whispered, "That was beautiful." They didn't say it loudly, but the words carried enough emotion that it echoed through the crowd. Only then did she lift her head slightly, though not fully. She gave a small nod. Not quite a smile, but not sadness either, just a quiet acknowledgement. Her mind was still floating between the present moment and the memories she had stirred awake. The melody she played wasn't just music to her. It was a part of her past, tied to someone she cared about and lost. She hadn't expected those old feelings to return so suddenly. Now they sat heavy in her chest, reminding her of both the warmth and the pain that music used to bring. She felt the audience's eyes on her, not judging, just absorbing. She wasn't used to this. She never liked attention. She didn't know what to do with so many people waiting for her next move. The silence stretched a little longer, gentle but thick. She carefully pushed the piano seat back and stood up. People instinctively stepped away, giving her room. She wasn't trying to escape. She just needed space to breathe. When she finally stood fully, she faced the room. Her voice wasn't loud when she spoke, but it carried enough for everyone to hear. "I haven't played in a long time," was all she said. And somehow, that single sentence gave everyone more understanding than a long explanation could. The man who had dared her swallowed hard. "I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable," he said, his tone softer than anyone had ever heard from him. She shook her head gently. "It's okay." It was the truth. His teasing had been the push she didn't know she needed. A woman from the group stepped closer, her expression warm. "You should play more often if it makes you feel like that," she said kindly. She didn't answer right away. She wasn't sure how the music made her feel. It filled her with peace and sadness at the same time, and she wasn't ready to unpack it all. Instead, she glanced back at the piano. The sight of it almost made her heart flutter again. It looked different to her now, no longer just an old piece of furniture. It had become a reminder of who she once was. Before she could gather her thoughts, someone else stepped forward. An older man who usually stayed quiet at events spoke up. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "sometimes life gives us small moments to open doors we think are closed. Maybe this is one of those moments for you." His words reached her deeply, though she didn't show much on her face. She simply lowered her gaze for a moment, letting the idea settle. The man who had dared her added softly, "I really didn't mean anything by it. I was just messing around. I didn't know." He gestured helplessly at the piano. She nodded again, this time more calmly. "You didn't do anything wrong." Her voice was soft but steady. The crowd relaxed a little after that. The tension eased into a softer atmosphere, something warm and collective. People began whispering among themselves, still glancing at her, still moved by what they had witnessed. She stepped away from the piano and moved toward one of the nearby tables. She needed to reset her breathing to ground herself again. Someone offered her a glass of water, which she accepted with a grateful nod. As she stood there, she could feel the environment shifting around her. People weren't looking at her in the same way they had earlier. Before, they saw her as the quiet woman who blended into the background. Now, they saw someone with a story. Someone who carried something fragile and beautiful inside her. It made her feel exposed. But not in a painful way, more like she had revealed something she didn't expect to share. The man who dared her approached again, slower this time. "Can I ask something?" he said. She looked up at him, unsure. "Why did you stop playing?" he asked, not in a pushy way, but like someone who genuinely wanted to understand. She hesitated. The question touched a place she wasn't ready to open fully. She took a small sip of water before answering. "Life changed," she said quietly. "And when it changed, music didn't fit anymore." He nodded, respecting the boundary. "I get that," he said, even if he didn't completely understand. Someone nearby added softly, "Well, you still have it? Whatever you had before, it's still there." She didn't know how to respond to that. She didn't play for approval. She didn't play for praise. She didn't even know if she played because she wanted to. The music just came out of her when she touched the keys. She glanced around the room, noticing the way people were still moved. A few had soft smiles, a few looked thoughtful. She realized she had changed the mood of the entire evening with just a few minutes of music. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve and whispered loudly enough for others to hear, "She plays nicer than the songs on my tablet." The mother gave an embarrassed smile, but everyone else chuckled softly. The small laugh eased some of the tension in her shoulders. She looked back at the piano again, feeling drawn to it, but also afraid of what might surface if she touched it again. Someone approached her from the side, a middle-aged woman with a calm face. "I used to play too," she said gently. "Then life happened, and I stopped. It's hard to start again. Sometimes it hurts, but sometimes it heals." Her eyes softened at those words. They felt true in a way she couldn't explain. The older woman continued, "You don't owe anyone a performance. But if it felt good to play again, even just a little, maybe that means something." She didn't answer, but she didn't pull away either. The words settled into her, mixing with her own thoughts. A few minutes passed as people slowly drifted back to conversations, though the atmosphere still held a quiet reverence. The man who dared her joined his friends again, but his eyes kept drifting toward her, guilt and admiration mixing in his expression. Finally, she walked back toward the piano, not to play, but just to stand near it. She rested her fingertips on the wood again. Feeling the faint roughness of the scratches, her heart felt lighter and heavier at the same time. She wasn't sure what the music meant to her now. She wasn't sure if playing again would heal her or reopen wounds. But she knew one thing for certain. The music wasn't gone. It was still inside her, waiting as she stood there. The crowd quieted again, watching but not pushing. She took a deep breath, a slow, steady one that filled her lungs with something she hadn't felt in a long time. The crowd slowly returned to their conversations, but none of them went back to the loud, casual tone from earlier. Everything felt softer now, as if the room itself had changed. People were still glancing at her from time to time, not out of curiosity or gossip, but with a kind of gentle respect. They had seen a piece of her that she never planned to show, and it stayed with them. She stood near the piano, her hand resting on its wooden surface. She didn't play again, not yet. She simply stood there, letting her heartbeat settle and her mind clear. The quietness inside her felt strange, like the calm after a storm. She wasn't sure if she liked it or feared it. The old memories that the music awakened were still hovering in her thoughts. They were warm but painful, wrapped in both love and loss. She closed her eyes for a moment and let the feelings pass through her, not pushing them away like she used to. One of the older volunteers approached her slowly, careful not to startle her. "You did something brave today," the volunteer said softly. She opened her eyes and turned toward her. "I don't know if it was brave," she replied. "It was," the older woman insisted, with a kind smile. "Letting people see a piece of your heart. Not many can do that." She didn't know how to respond. She wasn't playing to impress the room. She wasn't trying to be brave. It just happened, one note after another, one memory after another. She sighed gently. "I didn't mean to make everything so serious," she said. The woman chuckled softly. "Music makes its own mood. We just follow it." She allowed herself a small smile. Not a big one, just a faint curve of the lips, the kind that faded almost immediately as the volunteer walked away. The man who had dared her finally found the courage to approach again. He walked slowly this time, as though asking permission with his steps alone. "Hey," he said quietly. Stopping a few feet away, she looked at him but didn't speak. He rubbed the back of his neck, searching for the right words. "I know I already said sorry, but I really mean it. I didn't think... I was just joking around. I didn't know you had a history with music." She nodded lightly. "It's fine. You didn't know." He hesitated. "Are you okay?" She looked at the piano again before answering. "I think so. Just remembering things." He followed her gaze to the piano. "The way you played." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "It felt like you were telling a story, not just playing notes." She didn't reply, but her silence wasn't cold. It was thoughtful. He continued, "If you don't mind me asking, was music something important to you before?" Her chest tightened. She held her breath for a moment and then released it slowly. "It used to be everything to me," she said softly. He nodded. "What happened?" She didn't want to dive too deep. "Not here, not now." She shook her head gently. "Life." He didn't push further. "Well, if you ever want to play again, I think everyone here would listen." She didn't answer. She didn't know if she wanted an audience. She didn't even know if she wanted to continue for herself. She stepped away from the piano, finally, and walked toward the refreshment table. She poured herself some water, feeling the coolness calm her nerves. A few people smiled at her as she passed, and she offered a subtle nod in return when she stepped back into the main area of the community hall. She noticed a small girl sitting on a chair with her legs swinging. The girl must have been around 8 or 9. She was staring directly at her. When their eyes met, the girl brightened. "That was really pretty," she said without hesitation. The simple, honest compliment softened her heart. "Thank you," she replied gently. The girl tilted her head. "Can you teach me one day? I want to make sounds like that too." The question caught her completely off guard. She blinked slowly, unsure how to respond. A part of her felt warm at the idea, but another part of her tightened. Teaching meant returning fully to the world she had left. She crouched down slightly to meet the girl's eye level. "Maybe," she said, giving the softest smile. The girl grinned as if maybe was as good as yes. She stood back up and continued walking around the room, trying to settle her thoughts. The hall had returned to its usual gentle noise, but nothing felt the same to her. Every corner felt touched by what happened at the piano. Even she felt different. One of the organizers approached her with an encouraging smile. "You know," the organizer said, "we've been thinking about hosting a small talent night. Nothing big, just community fun, I think." "Well, I think you'd be amazing if you ever wanted to perform." She shook her head immediately. "I don't perform. You did today," the organizer replied calmly. She opened her mouth to deny it, but stopped. She hadn't performed. She had expressed there was a difference. But maybe the organizer's point still stood. "I don't know," she said softly. "Just think about it." No pressure. The organizer walked away, leaving her alone with her thoughts once again. She wandered toward a quiet corner of the hall. The lights were dimmer and the noise softer. She leaned against the wall, crossing her arms gently as she looked at the people moving around the room. A few minutes passed before someone else approached. It was the same older man who had spoken earlier about life opening doors. He walked with slow, careful steps. "It looked like you're thinking deeply," he said with a kind smile. She nodded, unsure how much to share. "Music has a way of waking things inside us," he continued. "Sometimes things we thought were gone. Sometimes things we're afraid to feel again." She lowered her eyes. "I stopped playing after someone I cared about passed away," she admitted quietly. The man nodded slowly, as if he had expected something like that. "The person who encouraged you to play?" "Yes," she whispered. The man let out a soft breath. "Loss can close us off from the things we love. We think avoiding them will protect us. But sometimes, letting them back in helps us heal." She didn't answer, but her throat tightened. "You don't have to figure everything out today," the man added gently. "But don't walk away from what you felt on that piano. It wasn't just sadness. There was beauty in it, too." She blinked back the heaviness in her chest. "I'm scared of going back to it," she admitted. "That's exactly why it might be what you need," he replied. His words lingered even after he walked away. She stayed in the corner for a long moment, letting the feelings move through her. Slowly, the crowd began getting ready to leave. Families grabbed their jackets, kids collected their belongings, and the noise in the room shifted to the usual end-of-night chatter. She watched as people waved goodbye to each other, but many still glanced her way, offering gentle smiles or small nods. They weren't trying to pressure her into anything. They were simply acknowledging the moment she had created. The man who had dared her approached one last time before he left. "You know," he said with a small smile, "if you ever decide to play again, I promise I'll never tease you about anything ever again." She finally let out a soft laugh. It wasn't loud, but it was real. "Deal," she said. He smiled and walked away, leaving her alone near the piano. When the hall grew mostly empty, she walked toward the piano again. The lights above it were dimmer now, casting a soft glow over the keys. She ran her hand along the smooth edge of the lid. She didn't sit down this time, but she didn't walk away either. She stood there quietly, absorbing the silence, the memories, and the possibilities that had opened without warning. A small thought whispered inside her. Not strong yet, but present enough to notice, maybe. Maybe she wasn't done with music. Maybe the part of her she had buried so deeply was ready to return. Part 4 ends with her standing by the piano long after the others have left, quietly facing the truth that the music inside her is waking up again, that she may not want to silence it anymore. The room stayed completely still after the last note faded, as if everyone was unsure whether they were allowed to breathe yet. She kept her hands resting on the keys for a moment, feeling the warmth slowly leave her fingers. It had been years since she last played like this. Years since she let herself fall into music without fear or doubt. For a second, she didn't even look up. She wasn't sure what she would see on their faces. She only knew her heart was beating too fast, and her eyes felt heavier than before. When she finally lifted her head, the silence broke into soft applause that grew louder and louder. Some people were smiling, others looked surprised, and a few looked emotional in a way she didn't expect. The man who had dared her stood frozen near the back of the group. His loud confidence had disappeared. He looked almost humbled, as if someone had gently knocked the wind out of him. She stood up slowly, feeling slightly embarrassed by how many eyes were on her. She wasn't used to this. She usually blended into the background, helping quietly without drawing attention. Now everyone seemed to want to say something to her, which made her unsure of how to react. She stepped to the side of the piano and tried to make herself smaller. But one of the older women from the community center walked up first, smiling kindly. She didn't ask anything. She just reached out and held her hand for a second, giving it a soft squeeze, like she was thanking her without words. That small gesture warmed her. It was simple, gentle, and honest. Then someone else approached and asked where she had learned to play like that. She hesitated before answering. She hadn't talked about her past in a long time, not because it was a bad story, but because she always felt like people wouldn't really understand. But the faces looking at her now didn't seem pushy or curious in a rude way. They looked like people who genuinely wanted to know her, so she shared a little. Only as much as she felt comfortable sharing. She told them she used to play as a child, and that music had been a big part of her life once. She didn't say why she stopped, but she hinted that life had changed, and she had to leave it behind. The crowd accepted her answer without pushing for more. Meanwhile, the man who dared her still hadn't moved closer. He looked conflicted, as if he wasn't sure if he should approach her or stay where he was. Eventually, he took a small step forward. Then another. When he finally reached her, he didn't know how to start. His voice, usually loud and full of jokes, sounded strange, quiet, and careful. "Didn't expect that," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I mean, I didn't know you could play." "I shouldn't have teased you," she nodded politely. She didn't feel angry at him, just surprised at how different he seemed now. People make jokes without thinking sometimes. She understood that. What mattered was that he seemed to understand how his actions had made her feel. He continued, "You were incredible. I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable." She gave him a small smile. Not a big one. Just enough to show there were no hard feelings. "It's fine," she said quietly. "I'm glad I played." He looked relieved. More relieved than she expected. He stepped back a little, giving her space again. Someone from behind suggested that she should play at the community event next month. The idea made her heart jump. She didn't know if she was ready for that. Playing today had been an unexpected moment of courage, pushed out of her by teasing. But performing in front of a crowd on purpose? That felt like something much bigger. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at the piano again. The keys were slightly worn, the wood scratched from years of use. But even in its imperfect state, the piano felt familiar. It's like something she once knew deeply. A few more people came up to her, each offering a kind word. She wasn't used to this much attention, but it didn't feel overwhelming. It felt warm, safe. She started relaxing, little by little, as the gathering slowly returned to normal. The noise in the room rose again, but something felt different. People were still talking about her performance. A few children ran their fingers across the keys, trying to imitate the sounds she created. The older woman who had squeezed her hand earlier asked her if she wanted tea. She accepted. It felt nice not to rush away. The man who had dared her joined a few others at the back of the room. She noticed that he kept glancing at her every now and then, but not in a bad way. More like he was still thinking about what happened, trying to understand how someone so quiet could have such a strong presence when playing. As she sipped her tea, she allowed herself to reflect on the moment. She hadn't realized how much she missed playing. Not just the notes or the sound, but the feeling, the way music let her breathe in a different way. The way it made her feel connected to herself again. One of the organizers of the gathering approached her gently. "If you ever want to practice here," he said, "the room is open most days. You're welcome anytime. Just ask for the key." Her eyes softened. That offer felt meaningful, almost like an invitation to reclaim a part of her life she had left behind. She thanked him, and he nodded warmly. Later, when the room began to empty, she stayed behind to help put things away. She had always helped quietly before, blending into the background. But tonight, people treated her differently, not because she was special, but because they had seen a side of her they never knew existed. She felt seen. Not in a dramatic way, but in a gentle, human way. The man who dared her approached again near the end of the night. This time he seemed more comfortable, less nervous. "Are you coming again next week?" he asked. "I think so," she said softly. "Maybe," He nodded, smiling a little. Good. You should. She wasn't sure what he meant, whether he wanted to apologize again, or just talk to her, or maybe watch her play if she felt brave enough. But his tone wasn't overconfident like before. It was sincere, respectful. When she finally stepped outside, the air was cool, and the sky was dimming into evening. She walked slowly, feeling lighter than she had in a long time. It wasn't just because people admired her playing. It was because, for the first time in years, she had allowed herself to touch something she loved. She had lost. She had lost. She looked up at the sky and took a long breath. She didn't know if she was ready to return fully to music. She didn't know if she could perform at the next event or even play again soon. But she knew one thing. Today reminded her she still had a part of herself. She had not lost forever. Sometimes all it takes is one unexpected moment. One dare, one soft push to open a door you believed was closed. And as she walked home, she felt something new, something small but strong, growing quietly inside. Her hope that maybe this wasn't the end of her story with music. Maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something new.